Statements. So here's something that survivors of narcissistic relationships often have in common with narcissistic people. Statements. And yet it is completely different at the same time. So let's do a little narcissism 101 here. Narcissistic people care deeply, and I mean deeply, statements about what other people think of them. Okay, and this creates a very complicated and messy dynamic for someone with this kind of personality. Statements. Narcissistic people's need for other people's approval, honestly, and their admiration is part of their excessive need for validation. Statements. People with these personalities almost need to be admired, valued, and desired to an extreme level, like constantly. Statements. It's like expecting a parade if they empty the dishwasher or wanting a parent of the year trophy if they put the kids to bed. Statements. Or applause and speeches if they pay for dinner. But they also care about what people think of them in general. And this is where it starts to get strange. Statements. It's not just about admiration, they care about opinions. Narcissistic people care what you think of them, and that fact makes them feel vulnerable. Statements. It makes them feel weak that they care what other people think. But this vulnerable, fragile part is not fully in their awareness. Statements. It kind of hides inside them as a feeling they cannot clearly name or understand. Because of that, statements. Narcissistic people will often walk around with expressed contempt or internal contempt for others. You might hear things like statements, I don't give a damn what your sister thinks of me, or your friends are losers. Any opinion those people have of me is trash. Statements. Or my boss is a nepo baby jerk who doesn't even deserve their job, so why should I care what they think of me? You hear that kind of talk a lot from them. Statements. Or instead of contempt, you may see outright anger. That inner vulnerability, that sense that they do care what others think turns into shame. Statements. They get reminded on some deep level, I'm not a grand, all-powerful being. I'm just ordinary. Again, none of this is happening in clear statements, conscious awareness. But when that insecurity gets triggered and that shame gets activated, they lash out, they rage at other people. So if they think statements, for any reason that you don't think highly of them or that you think less of them, it's not just contempt anymore. Statements. You may end up facing their anger or their wrath. You may even understand this pattern and try to show the narcissistic person some grace. Statements. You might excuse their tantrums and their contempt by telling yourself it's just insecurity. But you can only do that for so long. Statements. It's exhausting to live under a constant dark cloud with someone who is always so dismissive, so contemptuous of you. And not just you, statements, but of almost everyone. You can't give them feedback because it always comes back at you as anger. And if you ever try to have a gentle statements, supportive conversation like saying, hey, it can be hard when we feel like people don't like us, they may explode. They'll scream something like, statements. I don't care what anyone thinks about me. I don't care what a bunch of idiots think about me. Statements. Do you really think I care what anyone thinks about me? If you've lived through this, you know exactly how this goes. Statements. Even when you try to be soft and understanding, like, yeah, it hurts when people don't like us, they snap back with statements. I don't care. And this is where things get interesting, because you know who else cares a lot about what other people think of them. Statements. People who have been through emotionally abusive, antagonistic, narcissistic relationships. But the reason is completely different in most cases. Statements. Once you have been through a narcissistic relationship, and this is especially true if this is how you grew up, what other people think of you. Statements. Or what you believe they think of you becomes tied to safety. It becomes about survival. If you grew up with a narcissistic parent, developing a clear statements, independent sense of yourself is actually dangerous. When a child grows up with proper emotional attunement from a parent, they learn to trust themselves. Statements. They get feedback from the world about their feelings, thoughts, and hopes, and that feedback is realistic and supportive. Over time, an assertive statements. Individuated person develops someone who feels capable and believes they have permission to exist and express themselves. Statements. But that does not happen if you have a narcissistic parent. In that environment, expressing yourself is risky. Expressing a feeling is a problem. Statements. Without attunement, the child keeps looking outside of themselves for answers. Am I okay? Am I doing the right thing? Do people like me? Statements. Having a narcissistic parent means you never get to build that critical inner sense of self-trust. So you stay stuck in this loop of wondering statements. Does anyone even like me? And constantly reading into other people's behavior. For example, you might think, I don't think they like me statements. They sounded cold, even when it has nothing to do with you. Or someone cancels plans and you personalize it. Statements. You replay it in your mind and wonder what you did wrong and whether they still like you. Statements. Survivors of narcissistic and emotionally abusive relationships care about what people think because it equals safety. Statements. And when you combine that lack of self-trust with the survivor's tendency to blame themselves and think, if it's my fault, statements. At least I can fix it. You get someone who cares far too much about what others think of them or what they imagine others think of them. Statements. But here's the key difference. Most survivors of narcissistic relationships don't respond with anger or contempt. They usually respond by trying harder. Statements. Let me be the perfect friend. Let me be the perfect partner. Let me be the perfect parent, employee, neighbor. They become overly available. Statements. They listen more. They change plans. They bend themselves into shapes trying to get it right so others will see them as good, reliable, kind. Statements. And safe to keep around. It's not about applause or admiration. It's more like, I just want you to like me. Statements. People who experience relational trauma often swing back and forth between wanting closeness and being afraid of people. Statements or feeling completely drained by them. People start to feel scary statements because you're doing so much emotional work to get everything right so others won't reject you. Add a strong fawn response on top of that statements and you're completely exhausted. You end up feeling awful about yourself. So yes, both groups care about what people think statements, but the dynamics are very different. It gets confusing because if the narcissistic person cares deeply about what people think, and you, as the survivor, statements, also care deeply about what people think, you may feel empathy for them. You might say to yourself, I get it, statements. I care what people think too. But the behaviors are not the same. You're not raging at everyone. You're not filled with contempt, statements. You're not walking around saying, I don't care what anyone thinks of me, statements. One of the hardest parts for survivors of narcissistic and emotionally abusive relationships is that not only do you care about what others think for reasons tied to safety and attachments, but the narcissistic person's opinion of you changes constantly, hour to hour, day to day. Statements. You never get a stable sense of how you are seen by the most important person in your life, so you can't even anchor yourself to that. Statements. Caring about what is thought of you and endlessly thinking about it can start to feel like the only way to survive the day. Statements. This is very different from the insecure emptiness of the narcissistic person who cannot or will not connect with their vulnerability. Statements. They crave people for validation and at the same time resent them for having power over how they feel. Statements. Survivors don't usually crave and hate in the same way. They want connection, real connection. But deep down, statements. Many survivors don't believe they're good enough to be chosen or to stay. Do all of us care what people think of us? Of course. We're human. Statements. We're a social species. We need connection. We need other people in our lives. Because of that, some level of caring about impressions is normal. Statements. But when caring about what people think can ruin your day, make you feel unsafe, or in the case of narcissistic people, turn into rage or contempt, statements, then it becomes a problem. When it makes us constantly anxious, that's a problem. There's an old quote often attributed to Lao Tzu that says, statements. Care what other people think and you will always be their prisoner. I don't think any of us will ever reach some enlightened state where we truly don't care at all. Statements. In fact, not caring at all veers into something closer to psychopathy. So the quote doesn't fully hold up. The goal isn't to stop caring completely. Statements. The goal is to not care so much that it controls us. Can we give ourselves permission to be who we are while still treating other people with respect? Statements. Compassion and awareness. Can we slowly learn to trust ourselves again instead of living entirely through the imagined opinions of others? Statements. That's the balance worth aiming for. Statements. Here is a lightly revised version of your script. The meaning, flow, and length are preserved. The wording is gently adjusted. is was and no is thus not reduced as. The language is kept simple and clear with no headings or subheadings, and it is as well over 5,000 characters. Statements that becomes much harder to do when our lived experience with other people has taught us that they can be unsafe, unpredictable, and even dangerous. Statements that they can switch their behavior in a moment. Statements. It is even harder when we ourselves have never had the space or safety to build a strong sense of who we are or to trust our own judgment. Statements. We don't have a history of relationships that felt reliable or secure. For many people who have survived narcissistic relationships, statements. The pattern becomes very clear over time. Being in a relationship often means giving yourself up, shrinking yourself, or walking away from your own needs. Statements. In contrast, for narcissistic people, relationships are often about power, control, and dominance over another person. Statements. Survivors tend to care deeply about what other people think because at their core, they don't trust themselves. Statements. Narcissistic people also care a great deal about what other people think, but for a very different reason. They need admiration, approval, statements, and validation to hold together those grand, inflated defenses they rely on. And when they don't get that admiration, statements, when they are made to feel ordinary or insignificant, they often respond with control, rage, or intimidation. Statements. They try to crush or silence anyone who makes them feel exposed or small. Statements. There are similar vulnerabilities and overlapping patterns between survivors and narcissistic people, but they show up in very different ways. Statements. And I want to be very clear about this because I know some of you are probably thinking, okay, come on, Dr. Ramani, try to be fair. Statements. That insecurity and that shame the narcissistic person feels means they don't feel safe either. And you're right. I fully agree with that. Statements. I truly believe we should acknowledge that another human being feels unsafe and insecure. Statements. And we can absolutely have empathy and compassion for that reality. But empathy and compassion do not mean you make yourself a target. Statements. They do not mean you become a punching bag. If the way a narcissistic person handles their lack of safety, their deep insecurity, statements, and their shame is by turning it into verbal attacks, emotional cruelty, or psychological abuse, then yes, you can understand their history. Statements. But you cannot stay and absorb that harm. You will wear yourself down, you will lose yourself, or worse, and staying will not fix them. Statements. It will not change their behavior. It will not suddenly make them feel safe. It just won't. Statements. You may also feel empathy because you recognize parts of yourself in this. You may care deeply about how other people see you. Statements. You may struggle with anxiety, with overthinking, with constantly trying harder, doing more, and being perfect so that you won't be rejected. Statements. That part is real. There are similarities there, but again, how it shows up is very different. Statements. One turns inward and tries to earn love through effort and self-sacrifice. The other turns outward and uses control, intimidation, and dominance to manage their fear. Statements. The reason I keep talking about this distinction is because I truly believe we can hold empathy for someone's past and still draw a firm line in the present. Statements. We can understand why someone became the way they are without accepting harmful behavior from them. When insecurity turns into abuse, statements, that is where the line is drawn. Full stop. It is not okay. Love does not require enduring cruelty. Love does not mean tolerating emotional harm. Statement. Staying in abuse is not compassion. Enduring abuse is not love.